geography. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual Menzies Lecture. For over 25 years, the Menzies Lecture has been the premier event in the academic calendar for those studying Australia in the UK. Previous Menzies Lecturers have included eminent scholars and public figures, including Michael Kirby, Mike Latham, Glenn Davis, and Frank Bongiorno. Tonight, we're privileged to hear from Professor Kate Fullagar, who will be unravelling the history of two of early colonial Australia's best-known figures, Bennelong and Phillip. Kate Fullagar is Professor in History at the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Australian Catholic University. She's also Honorary Professor of History at Macquarie University and co-editor of the Australian Historical Association journal History Australia. Kate specialises in the history of the 18th century world, particularly the British Empire and the many Indigenous societies it encountered. She is the author of multiple books, including The Warrior, The Voyager and The Artist, 3 Lives in an Age of Empire, which was published in 2020 by Yale University Press, and The Savage Visit, published by the University of California Press in 2012, as well as her most recent book, the book from which she'll be drawing on tonight, which is called Phillip and Bennelong, A History Unravelled, recently published by Simon & Schuster. She's also embarking on a very ambitious 6-volume project, editing with Katarina Tayewa, the cultural history of Oceania, which will be fantastic and a large piece of work indeed. Kate's work is widely esteemed for its creativity, rigorous scholarship, and beautiful writing. I'm absolutely thrilled that she's agreed to share her work with us tonight. So let's please welcome Professor Kate Fullagar.
Can you get the amplifier to work?
Yeah, it's not working. All right, so project a bit more. Project a bit more, or we could, so I think that's the mic there. That projection sound okay? Or I can try and get that mic.
Yeah.
I'm used to yelling at undergraduates, so it should be all right. Move this one. My PowerPoint going on. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along. I'm really loving my week here in Covent Garden. It's been about 6 years since I've been in London, so it's been absolutely wonderful to be back here in such gorgeous weather, at least today. Particular thanks to Agnieszka for inviting me. It's a real honour to come to this Menzies lecture. Following in such an esteemed part of people, other than possibly Mark Latham. I did not realise. She didn't tell me that in the invitation. It's also very special for me to come to King's College London. Both my parents were graduates of this university. They met here when they were doing their Bachelors of Science. So in more ways than one, I'm here because of King's College. So I'm really honoured to talk today about my new book, Bennelong and Phillip. It's published about 6 or 7 months ago in Australia, but I believe the Australian copies have arrived only in British bookshops about a month or so ago, so hopefully more accessible here than they were originally. The subtitle of the book, as you can see there, is A History Unravelled, because it narrates these biographies in reverse order, the reasons for which I'll explain as we go on. But because of this methodological choice, I'd like to start with the deaths of both our subjects. Deaths that occurred within 1 year of each other. Arthur Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, died in 1814 in Bath after serving the British Empire around the globe for more than 40 years. Bennelong, a Yiyura man from the Wongal clan, died in 1813 on Wallumattagal land, just north of his birthplace. His birthplace, Wongal land, is around about today's Balmain, if you know it. Wallumattagal land, just opposite the river, north of the river, round about Macquarie University, if you happen to know that. Bennelong died after an eventful 50 years of life, most of them leaving a mixture of Indigenous groups from around today's Sydney area. Their burial sites are some 17,000 kilometres apart, but the men are linked in contemporary memory as key figures in the development of Britain's colony at New South Wales. Bennelong and Phillip watched, taught and negotiated with each other on behalf of their respective communities during the initial period of contact from 1788. Now, because modern Australia deems that period of initial contact a few years after 1788, because modern Australia deems that period to be foundational to its sense of self, Bennelong and Phillip have come to assume outsized roles in the national imagination. And they represent something, together they represent something essential about both settler arrival and about Aboriginal possibility. For many, these men are also emblems of broader settler-Indigenous encounters. Phillip stands for the colonial forces that quadrupled their presence around the globe between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, while Bennelong symbolises all the many Indigenous peoples who confronted those forces. 200 years after their deaths, tussles over the men's respective remains reflect their standing in public consciousness. In 2018, the New South Wales state government purchased a plot of land in the suburb of Putney. It's our Putney, not your Putney. They purchased it upon advice from a committee which claimed that it contained the grave of Bennelong. The committee's geomorphologist located this site after extensive cross-referencing of historical texts and maps, historical photographs and surveys, and some, quote, ground-penetrating radar work. By the time of the purchase, the local council, which had initiated that research, was floating the prospect of a full-scale trench excavation. The motivation for that research and for the acquisition, though, was mixed. Most public observers in the past couple of decades have been keen to honour Bennelong because they now see that he was important to Phillip's endeavours. But many also believe that this honour is owed him because Bennelong suffered terminally as a result of his collaboration, which included a 3-year trip to London in the 1790s. In 2007, the Member of Parliament for the significant federal electorate of Bennelong asserted that for the man himself, there was no happy ending. He was scorned by the Europeans and by his own people. When the board of the Sydney Opera House, just for a minute because this is being recorded, I believe, for the 80s. Sorry, that's all right. So 1 year before that, 2006, the board of the Sydney Opera House, which is located on Bennelong Point, applied for when they applied for World Heritage listing, it stated that the Wongal leader had died alienated from both Aboriginal and European cultures. Official recent interest in Bennelong then has been undertaken mainly as an act of atonement for his apparently miserable later life. Phillip's remains have been under threat of exposure for longer than Bennelong's, but with an equally partial understanding of the man's history. In 2013, the high-profile Australian barrister, Geoffrey Robertson, you've probably heard of him, argued for the relocation of Phillip's body from St Nicholas's Church near Bath to Sydney's Botanic Gardens. He wanted the Australian government to give our founding father, Robertson's words, our founding father, a state funeral in gratitude for his enlightened genius, humanity, egalitarianism, and moral vision. That's Robertson. Robertson actually managed to get successive New South Wales premiers from opposing parties interested in this project and was even charged by one of them to start making inquiries. Robertson's proposal was not in fact original. Back in 1937, on the eve of the sesquicentenary of Phillip's arrival in New South Wales, several newspapers argued for the former governor to be disinterred and conveyed to Sydney. Before that, in 1907, the Sydney Morning Herald insisted that our brave pioneer and the first maker of Australia should be reinterred in the lands he helped to colonise. So today's interest in Phillip, as it is, today's interest in Bennelong, they're both animated by pretty strong emotions. Here, though, it's a particular kind of progressive settler nationalism that's driving the responses, right? So an act of a kind of a sense of atonement or guilt driving the interest in Bennelong, a sense of kind of progressive settler nationalism, shall we say, driving the interest in Phillip. Right. Neither plan, though, it should be noted, of excavating these men appears destined for success due to the conventions surrounding both of them against disturbing sacred grounds. Neither plan, though, needs to succeed if the fundamental aim is to honour each man's legacy, to gain deeper knowledge about the roles that they played, or to understand the history of modern settler-Indigenous relations in a fresh way. As I hope my new book shows, and I hope to show minimally here, all these aims can be achieved not by digging up the men, but by digging back through the multiple sources available on them. And some of those, two of those sources at least, include their chosen burial sites. That Phillip should be buried under slate in an English church, and that that Phillip should be buried under slate in an English church, and Bennelong should rest with kin in Yiyura country, reflects the most telling truths about them. The 5 years that Phillip spent establishing the colony in New South Wales constituted only a small part of his near-century dedication to the British imperial state. His service included fighting rival empires during the 7 Years' War, being seconded to allies to help preserve British power in the Atlantic, supporting the war against American democratic independence, spying for the government at various times on the European continent, and guarding the English coastline against French Republican invasion. Phillip was, in fact, far less a moral father of a single settler nation than he was loyal servant of an escalating superpower. He was lucky to end his days, therefore, where his heart had always remained, back at the centre of the British Empire. Bennelong's burial site is likewise apt. It's not the lonely grave of an outcast who's only now finding recognition and respect. For Bennelong shares his resting place with at least two other individuals. His last wife, a woman called Burong, and one of his first protégés, a man called Nambri. Long after his death, admirers and relations continued to visit his grave, mourning a man who had worked valiantly in maintaining local rituals, in performing leading roles in social ceremonies, and in protecting his region as best he could from the newcomers. All the visitors to Bennelong's grave, though, were Yiyura, which is the collective name that I'm using in the book today to describe the 15 or so clans located around Sydney Harbour in the 18th century. As such, these grave visitors, those people who were coming to Bennelong's grave in what the colonists called Kiss and Point, were increasingly unnoticed by the colonists, whose records still dominate perceptions of early Australia. Colonial observers did not see then that Bennelong was widely appreciated at the time of his death. But he did receive deep acknowledgement for his life when it passed, just not by the kind of people who would go on to determine the course of his public memory. So finding the most telling truths about Phillip and Bennelong in their grave sites leads me to the unusual narrative approach taken in my book. So it starts at the end of the men's lives, so close in time, and it unravels them back to their beginnings. This is general summary for you here. So it goes from their respective legacies and retirements, their final journeys and ponderings, their time together in London, and then their time together in Sydney, their difficult meeting, which was via Phillip's kidnapping of Bennelong, then their backstories, and finally their origins in blood and place. If a backrunning method feels counterintuitive, it nonetheless suits, though, the two overarching ambitions of my book. My first ambition was to offer a new picture of Bennelong and Phillip. Most accounts of these long twinned men, which were always told boards, focus only on the decade or so surrounding the formation of the New South Wales colony. Because this colony spurred the creation of others on the continent, other colonies on the continent, which then became a nation, its inaugural leader tends to be depicted in a patriotic light. Phillip is made to express the qualities that the resultant nation most identifies with, as Jeffrey Robertson would put it, humanity, egalitarianism, and moral vision. Because Bennelong represented the people hit hardest by Philip's colony and by the nation that then rose over it, his image has been coloured more by loss. Sometimes Bennelong's been blamed for that loss, which is generally more the sense through the 19th century. Sometimes he's been pitied for that loss, which is more the vibe in the 20th century. But loss is the theme that prevails overall. Telling the story from the end of the men's lives back to their beginnings upturns, I hope, how we arrive at their most commonly told death. Once we learn, for example, about Philip's extensive counter-revolutionary activities in Europe after his governorship, it becomes harder to see his short stint in New South Wales as the pinnacle of an especially liberal career. Likewise, once we trace through the final 2 decades of Bennelong's life, thoroughly immersed as they were in the rich and complex Indigenous culture of the Yiyura, it becomes less feasible to believe that he lost his connections to kin. Shifting the frame of Australia's 2 most foundational figures away from a narrow settler context, away from myths about liberal values, and away from a sense of Aboriginal doom, changes how we think about the nation's origins and about its future. So the second ambition of this book is to experiment a little bit with traditional Western ways of narrating the past. Traditional modes of history writing in colonial settings, such as Australia, has an interesting if little noticed effect of what one Indigenous scholar has called firsting and lasting. That is, histories often emphasise settler firsts and Indigenous lasts. This emphasis is not innocent. Stories of the settlers' first famines, first battles, first crops, first post offices, and so on, imply that the settler destiny can only grow more capacious, right? Because obviously you're waiting for the stories of the second crop and the second famine and the second post office. The tales of last Indigenous chiefs, last Indigenous performances, last Indigenous language speakers tends to naturalise the idea that those people are incompatible with the future, because there's no sequence that you're really looking at for. As Grace Karskens puts it in the Australian context, in settler history, we seem to be searching constantly for beginnings. But in Aboriginal history in the colonial period, so often the search is for endings. So by tracing the lives of 2 key Australian historical figures in contrary order, I wanted to test some of the assumptions that emerge from thinking in terms of firsts and lasts. So let's start with Philip. When Philip died in 1814, he'd been retired from all government service for roughly 8 years. He spent the bulk of his retirement in his leased house in Bath, near the fashionable Circus precinct. On the surface, this was a fine finale for an esteemed ex-governor. But the slim evidence that exists suggests that he didn't particularly enjoy it. His retirement from the Navy had been forced. He'd always wanted to do more to help Britain in its contemporary fight against the French Revolution. The Navy had eased him out of all positions in 1805 when he was 67. The Navy wanted younger men for such a cutthroat war as the French Revolutionary Wars. There are 2 letters that have recently surfaced from Philip to his second wife, Isabella, and they suggest that his marriage was not especially happy. Other bits of evidence from those who visited him in those years also hint at somewhat restless soul. Before retirement, Philip had worked again for the Navy, as he had for most of his life. Overall, he served for 9 years, helping Britain in its war against revolutionary France. That's nearly twice the number of years he served as Governor of New South Wales. Those 9 years included 4 years supervising naval impressment, which was the deeply unpopular method of forced naval recruitment. He also spent 3 years supervising the Sea Fencibles Unit, which was a kind of paramilitary, para-naval unit that existed through the French Revolutionary Wars, which was supervising seacraft who guarded British shores. And before that, he managed to get in 2 final years of active naval service, chiefly in home waters or in Portuguese waters, fighting the Spanish allies of France. Serving the Navy was Philip's greatest obsession in life, far outweighing any romantic or familial attachment he ever had. This obsession mainly stemmed from his abiding life passion, which was the defence and indeed advancement of Britain itself. This passion did not extend merely to following orders. There's evidence to suggest that he took to heart the government's attitude of the day, which was an actual burning hatred of French revolutionary ideals. He once likened the French revolutionaries to spiders who, I quote, when one web is destroyed, immediately begins another until destroyed by their own work. His politics seemed closest to that of the presiding Prime Minister of the day, Pitt the Younger, imperialist and accepting of big states, but also royalist and unmoved by the principle of social liberty. This was anyway roughly the politics that Phillip wielded as a governor in the colony of New South Wales. Today, and really for the last century or so, Phillip has been heralded as a humanitarian and even by some as a harbinger of Australia's democracy. I think this stems from three things. One, there's a line that he wrote before arriving in Sydney that said New South Wales should never have slaves. Secondly, there's also a note in the Phillip journals where he insists on sharing rations equally amongst the officers and the convicts. And finally, of course, many settler Australians want to believe that their first founder was somehow related to the kind of modern liberal democratic state that they enjoy, or think that everyone enjoys literally today. I don't particularly know why people want there always to be straight lines from origins to present, but it is a common phenomenon in my trade. I know there are many historians in the room as well today. You've probably come across it a lot too. I speculate that this impulse to draw kind of straight lines from origins, even in the 18th century to today, is something about making people feel like they were destined to be as they are and where they are, and therefore maybe with diminished responsibilities to change what is around them. But was Phillip a humanitarian, a democrat, an enlightened genius, as Robertson says, of egalitarian moral vision? What he was, in my estimation, was a pragmatist who would do almost anything to achieve the aims of his highest priority, which was the British Empire. I argue in the book that Phillip was, in fact, a good example of an Enlightenment man because he personified a commitment to reason. I don't credit either Phillip or Enlightenment, though, with what we today might call kind of proto-liberalism, a desire to lift up the lowest of a society to the same economic and political benefits of elites. Some quick-handed version of what proto-liberalism might be. So let's go through those pieces of evidence that have spurred people to think about that, kind of the line that he writes about slavery, the line that he writes about equalising rations. They're the two main pieces of evidence anyway. Phillip's pronouncement against slavery had been informed by his personal experience of witnessing slave labour in the Portuguese colony of Brazil. There, back in the 1770s, he'd seen how slavery looked like it was an expedient force, but in fact, increased the amount of surveillance required, increased the legislations needed to curb smuggling, and also involved huge numbers of people who had no hope of ever joining the economy. Exactly the kind, there's a kind of the suggestions that you can see in the notes that he writes in Brazil. They are, of course, the essence of what his exact peer, Adam Smith, is writing at the time about the problems of slavery. So Phillip was against slavery because he thought that slavery was vastly inefficient, right? And Phillip was nothing if not efficient. As to the equalised rations issue between officers and convicts, Phillip waited until April 1790 before he ordered this equalisation. So that's more than 2 years after settlement, and it was prompted by the dangerously low stores of European rations left in Sydney Cove by that stage. Equal distribution was not a practice he had implemented earlier. Nor, by the way, was it a sign of true famine either, since Phillip knew that the harbour abounded with calories hopping around the bush and with edible greens. His April 1790 declaration was rather an acknowledgement that to deprive the largest demographic in the community of the most important link to home, which was European food, was to risk a riot. Most of Phillip's governorship can be seen as a constant calculus between what would instill fear and order and what would prevent violence and disorder. Oftentimes, he would opt for compromise or seemingly egalitarian options instead of aggression, But that's not necessarily the same as being driven by what in the 19th century we would call humanitarianism. Philip's calculus was always in play with his dealings with Indigenous people. He often did choose the diplomatic path, with no small thanks to Bennelong, but this was not to say that he didn't sometimes opt for violence. The case of Pemulwuy was perhaps the worst instance. When Philip suspected in December 1790 that a Bidjigal man called Pemulwuy had speared his gamekeeper, he ordered a troop of 50 armed colonists to march to Botany Bay to bring back, in retribution, 2 random hostages, as well as the decapitated heads of 10 others. That's not the behaviour of a gentle liberal. Nor, though, I should say, of course, is it the behaviour of a madman, despite how extreme it might seem to us today. It was instead the behaviour of a man who calculated in this instance that violence was the best way out of the crisis of an Aboriginal attack. Notably, it was as a direct consequence of his relationship with Bennelong that Philip learned that diplomacy was probably the more rational option in those moments. I won't go into too much detail about Philip's pre-New South Wales life, because it is in the book, which hopefully is now available to you. But suffice it to say that his time in Brazil was just as important to Philip as his time in New Zealand, in New South Wales. And it occupied almost the same amount of years. It's about 4 and a bit years that to put all the times that he was in Brazil together. Philip may loom large in Australian history, therefore, but it doesn't mean that Australia loomed large in Philip's history. To see that New South Wales was just one part of his overall career reminds us of the larger global contexts of penal settlement. So I will turn now to Bennelong. Like Philip, Bennelong spent his last few years in retirement. This was not in a fashionable consumer town, but instead on Wallumattagal land, which is around today's Parliament suburb, we think. The common story of Bennelong is that his years spent after his trip to England were a dismal time, alienated from both British and his own people, quite often drunk. This perception is what I worked hardest in my book to correct. The evidence suggests that nothing could be further from the truth. It's just evidence that officials at the time didn't understand. After Bennelong died in 1813, no officials noticed that there was a huge tribute battle waged in Bennelong's honour along the northern beaches. Few officials, in fact, even understood that esteemed Yiyura elders prompted such ritual battles after death. But a passing trading boat saw it and heard from his conversations that it meant that Bennelong must have been deeply revered. Most tribute battles involved around 24 warriors. Bennelong's attracted more than 200. Further, an emancipated convict in 1800 noted that Bennelong, when he was alive on Wallumattagal land, seemed to be a kind of chief or king, as context words. Now, they're not titles that make much sense in Yiyura society, but the convict's perception of them surely indicates a leader of men. And finally, from around this era, for roughly 8 years, there's many scattered pieces of evidence that Bennelong himself led ritual battles between Yiyura clans all around the harbour. Only warriors of high standing could be such a consistent and widely present participant in such customary practices. A few other pieces of evidence as well about his later esteem, which I can talk about in question time if you like. Bennelong's 3-year journey to England did not turn him into a pariah amongst the Yiyura. For Bennelong, that journey had always been part of a fact-finding mission. The facts he discovered there about British culture, compounded by what he saw in the colony when he went back in 1795, led him to change his mind about the best means of protecting the Yiyura. He changed from an approach of engagement, right, of protection through knowledge and conciliation, to an approach of refusal, protecting the Yiyura through quiet resistance, silence, and defiance. Bennelong was not therefore rejected by colonists, but in fact was the rejecter himself. When officers like David Collins saw this, they simply couldn't process such a decision and named it instead a backsliding into savage ways, a term that could only, in someone like Collins' mind, lead to disaster. The officers had hurt feelings. They'd known Bennelong for at least 4 years by this stage, and he had, after all, been one of the very few to visit their beloved homeland in the meantime. The reason why Philip took Bennelong to England back in 1792 was to prepare the British government for some kind of formal, legitimate settlement. The fact that a treaty never did occur for New South Wales doesn't mean that it was never going to occur. Philip knew that in most cases of British colonisation since the 16th century, there had been a legal negotiation. There was no particular reason for him to assume that New South Wales would be any different. It turned out to be very different. But in Philip's mind, I wanted to kind of throw out that possibility that he, as a man of the 18th century, would have naturally assumed that one day, soonish, it would happen. And what Philip knew was that in all those previous instances, the British had needed a liaison who could speak their language and understand their ways. This is why he had kidnapped Bennelong back in 1789, and also why he forgave Bennelong's involvement in payback for that kidnapping, which was a spear right through his shoulder, 10 months later. Without understanding Philip's strict commitment to preparing a Yiyura negotiator for treaty, none of that part of their mutual story makes sense. It makes no sense why Philip would have had Bennelong snatched from his people if he didn't want a counterpart kind of figure. And it especially makes no sense why he refrained from reprisals when it was clear to him that Bennelong had helped to orchestrate the spearing of him afterwards. Philip had the power to whip convicts who attempted that kind of thing, attempted spearing, actual spearing, attempted murder, with 100 to 150 lashes. And he did use that power when he wanted to. He just couldn't afford to use it with Bennelong. Bennelong became crucial to Philip. Not only did Bennelong promise to be the ultimate gift to his bosses upon Philip's return to England, he also helped Philip to forge decent order between the colonists and the Yiyura for at least 2 years of his reign. We know Bennelong made a big difference because for the first year of the colony, before Bennelong's kidnapped and kind of is in a relationship with Philip, there were more violent skirmishes between the two peoples than there were afterwards. Bennelong stepped in often when a Yiyura man attacked and guided Philip to a solution that didn't involve hostages or decapitated heads. After the disastrous Pemberley incident, for instance, when a Yiyura man called Barangaroo attacked a convict, Bennelong managed to make Philip offer only a cold shoulder rather than violence. And 5 months after that, another attack occurred by a Yiyura man furious with the colonial takeover of his land, and Bennelong protected him completely from Philip's vengeance. In fact, in this instance, Bennelong even got Philip to forgive the man, who's called Baladari, such that when Baladari later died of natural causes, he got to be, Bennelong managed to convince Philip to let Baladari be buried in his place of choice, which happened to be Philip's own garden. Bennelong negotiated for his people, not of course so that he might be a leader in treaty talks, because he doesn't necessarily share the same ambitions as Philip, who may not have even shared that idea with him. Bennelong's fervent wish was merely for the colonists to stop being so violent and preferably to pack up one day and go away. His motivation was similar to Philip's in that sense, in that he was a pragmatic defender of a beloved community. It's just that for Bennelong, that community was the 15 or so clans around Sydney Harbour, while for Philip, it was a world-spanning empire. Bennelong had some grounds, at least early on, for hoping that the colonists would pack up and go away one day. He had been 6 years old when the single tall ship of James Cook's Endeavour had sailed into Canay, or what Cook called Botany Bay. Bennelong probably did not see it, but he absolutely would have heard about it. He would have heard about the strange, pale people who docked for 8 days, seemed not to understand any protocols, took a bunch of stuff, including 50 spears, and then vanished as surely as they had arrived. It had been a destabilising moment, but one that thankfully, like most things, had passed. For the Yiyura, of course, Philip's fleet, though, never did pass. Perhaps by the time that Bennelong had retired back in Wannamaragal land, he realised that they might be here, in fact, permanently. He could reflect then that he once put everything that he had into mitigating the worst of their intrusions into Eora bodies, into Eora food supply, and into Eora ancestral lands. Now, as an older man, he chose to forsake the colonists completely, to spend the time that he had remaining amongst his own kin and country and culture. If colonists for the next 200 years after that chose to interpret that rejection as a form of kind of incomprehensible, drunken backsliding, that was truly not his problem. I thought I'd insert at this stage a bit directly from the book, from the conclusion of the book, because I hope it's something that's pertinent to British as well as Australian audiences. So here's the first page of the conclusion. I wrote, reversing through the whole lives of Phillip and Bennelong tells a new story about the explosive incursion of European empires into Indigenous lands. If Phillip somehow represents the foundation of one particular modern nation, Australia, his full, unravelled life demonstrates that the country began as an extension of a multi-pronged and reactionary global empire. Australia still carries within it the legacy of ferocious 18th century rivalry with other powers, which was mostly Catholic ones and always democratic ones, as well as an irregular deployment of laws regarding slavery and dispossession. Nations that emerge from such a past cannot reckon with the implications of their history if they remain immersed in myths about that history, especially myths entangled with a loose understanding of the Enlightenment. It should go without saying, this is my one kind of gesture to Britain here, it should go without saying that Britain too, as the nucleus of Philip's empire, has as much to reckon with as any settler satellite. If Bennelong represents the many First Nations people who faced European invasion during the birthing era of modernity, his long life, when unspooled, reveals that they did so actively, with a range of strategies and attitudes, a changing range of strategies and attitudes. Through Bennelong's actions, it's possible to see how Indigenous peoples played critical roles in the course of imperial transformation, even while they were the more afflicted party. They exacted retributions, they demanded concessions, they deflected inquiries, they withheld information, or otherwise confused imperial plans. Modern societies will only begin to address the problems wreaked by empire if they know the complex story of interaction between those who came and those who were already there. So in ending, I just want to have an acknowledgement that my book came out in the same month that Australians went to the polls to vote in a referendum on whether Indigenous people should have a constitutional voice to Parliament, that then in turn might begin the process of treaty negotiation that has been forestalled for 200 years. The dismal results of that referendum reveal that our reckoning with the failures, darknesses, and intricacies of the past has a very long way to go. We'll close up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that. We do have questions. I'll be the roving mic, although I'm actually not sure that it works. But we'll do our best. It's working? No. No? All right, we can just put it out. So can I ask for the first question from the floor? Yes.
Thank you, that was very interesting. Could you give us some examples? I think we know about the New Zealand contract with the Maoris. Could you give us some examples of some other ones that the British did that then failed to happen in Australia?
Yes, so my previous book has really been looking at Native America and the British Empire. And it was a nice transition to look at Phillip because he was intimately involved or understood the 18th century practice in North America with making treaties with people. And in every instance, up until Phillip's time, the British had made treaties with separate groups, the Cherokee, the Creek, and so on like that. When I mention that to people who even vaguely know about that, the first thing that they want to say is, well, those treaties meant nothing, right? Often they were very unfair. You could argue that maybe the Indigenous people don't really fully understand what they're signing up to, and all that's true, right? But to me, it's significant, and it can't be just dismissed. And certainly, well, it can't just be dismissed, because if New South Wales had had such a probably not very good treaty that Phillip may have drawn up, or his successor may have drawn up, it would have changed the future in that Aboriginal people would have always been understood from the beginning as coming under the remit of the law. Right? They would have been subjects of legality. And once at least you have that, even if that legality is highly debatable, contestable, and needing of reform, you don't get quite ridiculous instances of a nation having to go to a referendum in 1967 to vote whether they should be counted in the census, because they already would have been legal subjects. You don't also have the equally farcical situation of Australians going to referendum to decide whether they should have a constitutional kind of protected voice to Parliament, because they already would have been kind of integrated. So I think it makes a difference. So the instances that I know of are in North America, which is comprehensive for the British experience. I was giving a talk like this a couple of weeks ago, and a legal scholar came to me. I know there are you in the room. Oh, that's okay if you are. I wanted to point out that some British instances in India do not have treaties. But, you know, I think we can confidently say the vast majority by Phillip's time had British colonisation had a treaty.
And it didn't happen because of Bennelong's change of attitude, or because Phillip had now retired?
So why it didn't happen in New South Wales, also a hotly contested question. Well, maybe not that hotly, because most Australians don't believe that treaty was ever on the table, so they don't necessarily go down that path, but I think it was. So you have to kind of explain, why doesn't it happen in New South Wales, when I think that Phillip clearly expected it to happen. It's partly, I think, it's partly the circumstance of not having European rivals for the colony, which had never happened in North America, for instance. Every time the British are making a treaty with the Indigenous people, it's because they know that they could have made a treaty with someone else down the line, the Spanish, the French, whatnot. And so there doesn't seem to be rivals. Until the French Revolution, there's no knowing that that's not going to happen, that the French couldn't have come through to be a rival. And it's also, I think, the experience of Britain losing the 13 colonies in the Americas, you know, less than a decade before 5 years before they get to New South Wales. It changes British imperial thought to be much more organised, less patient, more hardline, and more determined to follow through and not kind of dilly-dally about with making bits and pieces of treaties and seeing how we go, right? So I think that, you know, there had previously been a generation or so ago an understanding that the British become more liberal after the loss of the American colonies. I think New South Wales kind of hard-line settlement kind of shows that the opposite in fact happened, that the British lost patience with what they thought had been a system that was too permissive and such allowed rebellion.
Let's get a show of first, and then I'll
Thank you so much. I just had a question about if you can tell us a little bit more about the evidence that you could use to kind of cast Bennelong in a different light. So the tribute battle, I think I understood, was from a ship that sailed past.
Yeah, so it's an American trader who observes and then publishes in a Scottish newspaper, which is strange. So the kind of ways that doesn't get picked up by traditional forms of early Australian history making, said, you know, I saw this huge tribute battle up on the northern beaches. We think maybe like Manly Heads or something like that. He asked someone, what does that mean? They said this is a tribute battle waged after a significant Yiyura person dies. And that guy says there's probably about 200 warriors. I kind of add in some retrospective kind of historical anthropology that suggests that most of those battles only have about 24. So we kind of already have an indication of something significant. There are other bits and pieces of evidence too, which I didn't talk about here, but only a few years after Bennelong dies, a kind of marginal clergyman goes to Wonnamadigal land, which is well away from the kind of the core bit of Sydney Cove where the offices are. A clergyman's in Wallumattagal land. He knows actually Bennelong's only surviving son, called Digi. He shows the Yiyura people a portrait that's been painted of Bennelong. There's a very poignant kind of writing up of that clergyman saying everyone wept and said that was Bennelong, he was our friend. It's just fascinating to me that that's actually occurs pretty much in the same year that Sydney Morning Herald is reporting, oh yeah, remember Bennelong who died a few years ago? He was such an incorrigible savage who never made good after all the things that we showed him. Right, so it's interesting that they're happening at the same time. It's the obituaries in the Sydney Morning Herald or Sydney Gazette that get kind of implanted in Australian history books, not this more ephemeral sort of evidence. There is more sort of tangential speculative evidence that I kind of discuss lightly, which is that Bennelong's sisters, he has 3 sisters, all achieved quite significant positions in the Yiyura society, which the anthropologists tell me would have been virtually impossible if Bennelong himself had been this disgraced, shameful person. So it's kind of, there is a kind of direct link. You can see that the sisters do well. We kind of think that Bennelong did well. And that the life of his surviving child, Digi, was also kind of, that he was well nurtured for. He was noticed by Yiyura people. Again, maybe contribute to a respect that hadn't really been noticed.
Thanks, Kate. Brilliant, really nice summary of your book, and I look forward to reading it. Just one question, coming back to the treaty issue. Is there anything in the fact that the Phillip's settlement in Australia was very much about forming a penal colony, not about not essentially about a settlement, British settlement in Australia?
I don't think there's too much in it, no, actually, because I think Phillip and his bosses, I mean, this is something that people do debate, but I think that Phillip and his bosses knew that the convicts would just be vanguard of India. The point of New South Wales was to have a foothold in the South Pacific, to forestall someone else having one. I kind of go into, obviously at the end of the book, because it's in reverse order, but the preliminaries to the decision that picks Phillip as the governor and that sends him on his way. The British government had been debating the idea of some Pacific foothold since the late 1770s. They're triggered in early 1780s from a piece of intelligence that they buy that says the French are secretly rearming their navy in the ports when they told the British they had an agreement after the American Revolution that they wouldn't rearm, and they would tell each other if they would. So the intelligence says the French are remobilising their navy. The British interpret that as they're going to make a claim to the South Pacific. Now we act. Otherwise, there's no particular reason why it's 1786 that you make the decision, right? It has to be explained kind of 6-7 years of time lag when they're just sitting on it and thinking about what to do. So I like to kind of suggest that Phillip also knew that, and that he knew that the point of the settlement was to be permanent, expanding, and maybe a replica of the New World.
Some questions on the other side, and I'll come back.
Thank you. I have so many questions. I have 1,000 questions. The one that I really want to ask, I think, is do you think that, why did the Australian intellectual public, if you like, or even the historical profession, allow Inga Clendinen's book, Dancing with Strangers, to dominate the public discourse for so long? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So she's just asked me a very insider question. So 21 years ago, there was a book by Inga Clendining, very respected historian at La Trobe, who was mostly an American historian, but her last significant work, she moved into Australian history and wrote a book called Dancing with Strangers, which narrates the 5 years in Ford's manner, the 5 years of the early colony in New South Wales, so 1788 to when Phillip goes home. And as Kate suggests, it had remarkable sticking power. I mean, it just became the book that everyone referred to, academics and the public, which is interesting. And in that, she defends Phillip and says there was no real racial violent problem there, and says that Bennelong was a backslider, who is kind of iconic sentence that is very unusual for an historian to write, that really sticks in my mind. And she says, he should have died earlier in the days of hope, so that he wouldn't have had this tragic tale of, you know, the long tale, which she kind of brought into. If he died after, you know, sort of had gone home, then he could have remained the heroic story. So in terms of the characterization of Phillip and Bennelong, I find it a kind of a troubling book. In other ways, it was kind of a good book because it did actually actually inserted, maybe for the first time, a very vital sense of Aboriginal presence in the story of settlement, which for so long is not even kind of factored in. But the characterization of Phillip and the characterization of Bennelong did kind of stick with me a little bit. I didn't think that I was the first one, though, to push back. I think Grace Karskens, who I quoted earlier, her books are pretty much directly, I think, a straight up reply to condemning. Nowadays, if you go to Sydney International Airport, it's Grace's book that you can buy. You don't buy Clendenning's book anymore. So it took 21 years, but it's fading.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in what you were able to unravel about their personal relationship. How much did the 28-year age gap play on their relationship? What documentary evidence did you have about the fluency or literacy of Bennelong? And is there any evidence of them socialising or dining together?
Yes. Yeah, lots. That's a great question. So in terms of their age difference, yes, you've done the maths. So there's like, you know, nearly a generation, well, there is a generation between them. So if you kind of, I'd like to kind of picture them there, you know, in government houses, Lord in Sydney Cove. Phillip's about 50, Bennelong's about 24 or so. Bennelong early on gives Phillip your name, which has been translated to be father. And he says to Phillip, you call me an Aboriginal name, which he says translates to son, like father's son, which Phillip loved, right? And a lot of people like to write on that. I think though, delving down more into those words, we're talking to some linguists in Sydney, that what it really was kind of a respectful, you are my senior, as many languages have, you know, you change the words a little bit when you're talking to someone more senior, and then you expect to be called someone a bit more junior. So I think it was more about seniority and juniority rather than straight up father and son, which sort of tickled the colonists a bit more. It's noticeable that when later on, like a few years on, Bennelong does not use those words. He does not. He no longer refers to Phillip. He calls him Mr. Phillip. I think he figured out, oh, that didn't go down so well when I told him about these words. It didn't seem to produce the kind of polite effects that I wanted it to. So that's interesting. But I think quite often their relationship is called a friendship. And I didn't want to dispel the fact that they obviously did come to admire each other or not dislike each other. But I didn't use the word friendship because I wanted to always remind the reader that it was always a political relationship. They were fellow diplomats. I mean, it's remarkable that Phillip did accord him a kind of equal status, and Bennelong certainly acted as if he was Phillip's equal. So I didn't want to, I think the word friendship has inadvertently, I think, had the effect of kind of defanging well, depoliticising what was really going on. And so just to bring back the idea that this was always politics for them. They were diplomats. See the books of India House and Australia House. This is the region for diplomats. This is what they were. This is what they were to each other. For the first bit of their relationship, Bennelong did stay often in Government House, so they often were dining together. So at the governor's table, which is not where some of them later would have been. When Bennelong comes back, all of the governors that Bennelong sees, 4 more governors in his lifetime, all of them say you can still come back anytime you want, according to what Philip had said. Bennelong decreasingly takes up that invitation, but from the get-go, he was always invited to dinner at the servants' table, not the governor's table, which is probably why he didn't come off so like he declined the invitation.
Yeah, thanks to the Menzies Australia Institute supporting me, and I did actually go to Australia over the winter, so I read your book, Kate, which I really enjoyed. I was really impressed with this argument you make about it makes no sense, the visit to Britain, unless there was some sort of treaty that lapped us in Philip's mind. And I'm interested in the process by which you've got to that conclusion, because you don't say that in your earlier work, but at some point, but I wonder whether you always thought that, and you have to, it's only when you wrote this book you actually feel, actually I'm now going to make this claim, or was there some point in your historical your work where you thought, okay, I now feel that. And also, if I could, just a really quick second question. What the referendum last year seemed to reveal, I don't know if you agree, is that there seems to be a gap between what we thought was a sort of, amongst historians, a kind of settled kind of consensus about the violence and the dispossession of early kind of colonial Australia, and then I think some people were surprised when elements of the media were able to question that, and some members of the public seemed to not believe it, and I just wonder what the role now of historians should be going forward.
Yeah, the first question seemed easier. Well, the first question is, how did I come to the idea that, that Philip probably always had the treaty in mind, and therefore, once we have that kind of counterfactual in our mind, it makes a lot more sense of what happens between them. No, that was definitely a developing idea that I realised. I had been writing, I wrote about Bennelong in London for a very long time. My earliest work included another chapter on that, but only when I was writing this book that I wanted to think about the whole life of Bennelong. And, myself, along with most Australians who think about this topic of Philip and Bennelong, I just went along with the idea, there was a kidnapping, but it came out, but it must have been forgiven because Bennelong then moved into Government House and they had a friendship. The payback steering is controversial. Some historians don't think that Bennelong was the mastermind, or if they do, they still don't seem to connect it to a kind of a larger strategy. But when I kind of slotted it all together, and that's a benefit of doing it in a biographical sense, not just looking at the 5 years of New South Wales, because you can't then see the global context. You don't see the whole kind of political strategies that are going on and changing in each man's mind. So that was a great benefit for me to take the biographical lens. But it's only when you put it all together, thinking, why does this man who was instructed by the government to conciliate with the Indigenous people think that, kidnapping is quite a drastic way of conciliating? It's because he was absolutely desperate, because after a year, more than a year, he just couldn't make headway. So he said, I have to do it this way. This is drastic, because the ultimate orders are that I have to be able to produce a negotiator. There is absolutely no way a governor could have stood the humiliation of being speared by another party without exacting some retribution. It is so much what Australians want to believe that it should prove that he was magnanimous. Right? In Philip's context, it just would have proved he was an idiot if he didn't exact reprisals. But unusually he does. All his officers around him say, this is so weird, what the hell is going on? Right? They don't calculate why he's doing it. They just note that it's really strange. It makes sense to me, because this is the one guy that Philip couldn't afford to resolve. So it just helped, as you intimated, it only slotted in later, and I was able to put it all together. The second question, did Australians in the referendum not know about the violence, or did they just not listen to historians? What do historians think? I don't think that post-mortem has happened correctly yet. I think, actually, to be honest, only a very small minority of Australians, and they were the, people who would be enjoying the polemic of it, think that there was no violence in the past, right? What I deal with in the 18th century story is nothing compared to what happened in the 19th century. And I think that's probably now accepted by the public. what's the difference? What matters though is that when people go to the polls about making a decision for the future, they refuse to think that the past has any bearing. And that has to be well beyond historians' job to make the case that the past matters. Obviously, we've not done a good job so far, so yeah, a more humble way of saying that is maybe we need help to make that connection that the past does have a huge influence on the future. And referendums are always about history, right? Asking you to make a decision about the future based on something that happened or didn't happen in history. And Australians, of course, are extremely wedded to their history when it's some other event that they don't want touched, right? Like the memory of a particular war, a war overseas. So yeah, I think the history, the general historical landscape, is probably accepted. The difference is that when Australians make political decisions, they somehow didn't think that.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I guess I have two questions, one about Philip and the other one for Bennelong. I guess the first one for Philip is, if it's all right, if you could elaborate on what his experiences were prior to his becoming governor of New South Wales, if only because it fits into how other imperial figures, someone maybe like Sir George Arthur, before being Van Diemen's Land, been in Honduras, and eventually becoming governor of Bombay, how those experiences prior to Australia informed his eventual governorship. And then for Bennelong, I guess I was hoping you could elaborate on how, despite, you noted that he was a very influential figure in mobilizing or coordinating with other groups, not just his own indigenous group in like the Sydney Harbour Code, and how he was able to reach that position.
Yes, great questions. So what's Philip's background before he is asked to be the governor? So as we suggested, about 50 years old. He's the one who goes and confirms the piece of intelligence about the French rearming. So he is very well known to the Navy at that, well, obviously the Navy, but also the decision makers about colonial overseas possible settlements, sufficient that, they would say, okay, you just need a spy to confirm this intelligence. What I think is also something that, I don't want to push too hard, but is suggested in the book, that he's picked to be this governor of this colony because he's not really a super stellar naval commander. That doesn't sound too self-defeating, but he's not like some of the other governors that you just mentioned who actually get picked because they're brilliant. This is in the 1780s. I think the decision is made that you couldn't have afforded to send, an Horatio Nelson to a backwater like that. It's a waste of a naval commander. You also don't send a kind of brilliant bureaucratic mind like Evan Nepean, who's in the offices, who's making these decisions, because you just can't afford to lose that kind of brain power. You pick someone who only recently, he had his captaincy. Most of it had been awarded by when he was serving in secondment to Brazil, a British ally. So he was sort of slightly the second tier, I think. What he definitely had going for him, though, was unlike most naval captains, he had decent experience in managing land. He'd been a farmer for an interlude in between some of his naval posts. That's an interesting story that I like to kind of bring out to sort of leaven the endless tales of men that this book is. And that the reason why he has agricultural experience is because his first wife, who was significantly older than him and much richer than him, he had for 6 years managed her, they bought an estate and he managed the estate for her. What's kind of a little bit interesting, lightens the book up a little bit, is that in that marriage there's also another woman, that Charlotte Phillip, his wife, had always lived with long before she ever married Philip, and continued to live with long after. They had this very rare thing called a judicial separation, which is extremely rare in Britain at the time. It entails, it's like a prenup, it entails the fact that Charlotte got all the wealth back from Martha, which she then handed back. What was endlessly intriguing, I have to say that's a complete black hole for the biographies because people do not know what to do with that. I just absolutely loved it. I couldn't do enough with it. What was most stood out to me in investigating that little bit of the story is that Philip doesn't seem to have any animosity about that. Like he mentions while he's in New South Wales, I remember my wife and I have to make sure that if she dies, I mention in that will, because they're not divorced, separated. I mention in that will I have certain duties to fulfil, and he's thinking about it. And when he does get back, Charlotte has just died, and he does front up and sign the will as he's asked to, which means signing over most of that wealth to the other woman. Yeah, so it's interesting. Anyway, so combination of why he's picked is because he's a second tier naval commander, I think, but does have the tick of agricultural development. Why is Bennelong able to be influential beyond his own clan? That's a very good question. I speculate that even before the British arrived, he probably is a kind of shaman figure. Every clan has a few. And I think he might be because there's bits and pieces of evidence to show that he was a healer. And if you were that kind of healer figure, you could have already been able to go over clan borders more easily than other people. But I think also by the time that, he walks away from the colony after engaging with Phillip, I think most people had seen he tried his hardest to do what he could. And in some sort of, it was a respect for the efforts that he'd made, even though he was kind of pulling out of that job.
There's a question at the front and then one.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very stimulating lecture, and I look forward to reading the book. And I'm prompted that it seems to me in the last 10 years, Australia has gone through some re-evaluation of various chunks of its history. And one book that I particularly enjoy is Good, which is probably a very quirky view of Australian history.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think has some parallels in kind of breaking down some of these, traditional views, which you've obviously done as well, about the origins of British colonisation. But the book that seems to have stirred most is the book about by Pascoe about what is it, dark emu? And I'd be interested in your comment on that, obviously, in terms of a reinterpretation, particularly of the agricultural practices of the Aboriginal population. But also, I think in a way, this constant search that Australia still has for its history. And you see it manifest in London. You can go and see Arthur Phillip in the National Portrait Gallery. You can go to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and there's a great deal, the great image that we all remember of Charles Dance's painting of Captain Cook in every textbook that I ever remember.
Yep.
But I think particularly the Dark Emu book, and I know he's written a new book called A Black Duck. But it seems to me that the hostile reaction that seems to have generated is quite disturbing, really, because you've had the courage to go back and look at all this history again. And it doesn't hurt Australia to keep doing that, because the referendum makes me so sad. That outcome.
So this is a reference.
Thank you for what you're doing.
This is a reference to a book that was published 5, 6, 7 years ago by an Aboriginal person called Bruce Pascoe called Dark Emu. And it's unlike this, like the opposite of this, it takes a big macro survey of Aboriginal Australia before and at 1788. And makes the quite strident, possibly controversial claim. What he wanted to do was to disrupt the idea of Aboriginal people being hunter-gatherers, and therefore often the implication is kind of had no means of resisting the onslaught. And he wanted to show that instead they were forms of agricultural workers in terms of their social practices. It's controversial in that it's actually, I don't think it's particularly controversial amongst the right, because it doesn't actually make them change. I don't think it doesn't, I think people have accepted that we talk about Indigenous culture and talk about Indigenous history. It doesn't mean that they have to kind of like obviously vote in the interests of it, but I think that it endorses the kind of thing that the Indigenous culture is on the political landscape. It kind of annoyed a lot of people on the left because it does unfortunately buy into this stadial idea of hunter-gatherers, X, and we all aim to be agriculturalists, and so that eventually we can all be commercial consumers, whatever. I mean, this is, a stadial theory birthed in this empire, in Britain, which served Britain in the 18th century extremely well. There is nothing that makes Bruce Pascoe have to buy into that. It's that progression, that theory that should have been dismantled, not sort of flipping readership from thinking, oh, they were instead of going A, instead they were B. Actually, this whole system is a little bit weird and maybe deeply inappropriate for any Indigenous society. And isn't it interesting that it served European empires so well to have a theory of how men have developed? So I don't mention it too much in this book, chiefly because it takes such a macro view and my evidence is so kind of particular. So.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And I want you to talk a little bit more about the way you structured the book. So you kind of said that, one of the goals of doing it backwards is to disrupt the kind of fatalist cant of first and the last. But I want to know a little bit more about how you did it and what the challenges were narrating backwards, and whether you decided to do it from the start or whether this was kind of a moment of revelation during the research and writing process.
So it was something that I wanted to do before I started writing. I should say this kind of, well, the research on Bennelong has been a decade or so. So it wasn't sort of fresh research in that sense for me particularly, but I hadn't really written it up. I did have to kind of learn a bit more about Phillip. But I decided to do it backwards before I even started writing it. And of course I told my fellow historians this is what I was going to do, and they were horrified. And not because they, thought it was, silly. They were just worried for me, I think. And they just thought I was going to get into a huge muddle. But I did talk to one particular historian that some of you may have heard of called Tim Rouse, who told me, he reminded me of something that I did know, that, a lot of novels work that way, or some novels work that way. And I had read a couple of them, but I hadn't read at the time Martin Amis's Time's Arrow. People are familiar with that novel. And I'm a big fan of Martin Amis, but I hadn't read that novel, so I went away instantly and read that before I started writing this book. And if anyone has read it, they might remember that it begins with a man who's sitting in the lavatory when the lunch goes back up his body and down his mouth. And I just thought, oh, this is disgusting and horrible. And this is what my friend Tim Rouse is telling me, secretly and subtly, don't do this book because it's just going to be gross. So I just thought, okay, what is going on here? Why is this novel? I really don't like this novel, and how is this going to be different from the history I wanted to write? The difference is that in Martin Amis's book, time itself moves backwards, which is a whole other intellectual challenge, and possibly something an historian shouldn't really. Maybe a philosophical historian, but anyway, not me. So at least it was nice because it underscored to me what I was doing was narrating events in reverse order, not making time itself move backwards. So once I clarified that, it's just simply a matter of deciding what is the length of an event, I suppose. Now, writing it, I wrote the first draft really quickly, and because of course you write slower than you read, at that pace of writing, it seemed like all the little decisions I made about how an event goes forward was natural. And so everyone would agree with me about those decisions. Then my editor said, these are very arbitrary decisions that you made. Like this day goes forward and then that moment goes forward, and then how's the reader supposed to be able to keep up? So the second drafting was a bit more tricky than the first drafting, because I really was trying to be aware of then making it seem doable for the reader. Use the word disrupt. I did want to disrupt the reader, but I didn't want to scramble the reader. I had no interest in just completely throwing them at sea, like Martin Amis didn't seem to care. So I wanted to, hold the reader's hand and bring them along with me on this, slightly unconventional method, but not particularly too unconventional. So then my editor and I decided to put in a few extra reader aids to it. There's a forwards running timeline at the beginning. Each chapter has a summary, sort of in 18th century fashion, of what the thing's going to occur. So I did try and put in aids and sort of remind the reader we're going on this journey in reverse fashion, not to just, be mean to you, but just to make you think about what happens innocently, invisibly, in the histories that we normally read, which go forward. What else can we see by doing it this way?
All right, we need to start thinking about liberating Kate from our questions. If there's a burning one, sorry, if there's a really burning question, we could possibly take one more. Otherwise, there's a burning question. Of course there is. Okay, this could be it, and then we'll then I'll release everyone to one exception.
Thank you very much. I hope it is possible. You mentioned Bennelong's time in London and how his experiences may have affected his thinking.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on that? So it'd be fascinating to do. Thank you.
Yeah. So he spends 2 years all up. It's the first year that sort of follows a tradition actually of Indigenous people coming to Britain throughout the 18th century. Native Americans came before him, Pacific Islanders came after that. And there's a kind of a set piece really that he falls into that first year, which he seems to enjoy because it seems pretty enjoyable actually. He gets put up in a place in Mayfair that Ross and I went to, about half an hour walk away. He is taken on a reasonably familiar itinerary, not familiar to Bennelong, but familiar to his officials. Houses of Parliament, West End theatres, a good tailor, get outfitted with good clothes, certain spas around the place. There's kind of a lot of kind of naval stuff. Go down to the docks, look at the arsenal, look at the tower, look at Woolwich, and so on. You can't, I couldn't confidently say this in the story that he's having a good time, but there doesn't seem to be any disruptive moments there. What I have kind of elided, which is in the book but I haven't really talked about here, is that he actually goes with a younger kinsman as well, another Yiyura man called Yiyura, which Philip is more than happy to bring on an extra person because, if we're preparing negotiators, 2 is better than 1. Bennelong obviously wants him as, he's obviously somehow related to Yiyura. Unfortunately, after the first year, Yiyura sickens and dies, and he's buried in Eltham Church still today. And it's probably from that moment that it all starts getting a bit too much. He starts asking, Bennelong starts asking, when can I go home? By this stage, Philip has formally retired and John Hunter is the new governor to go out. And so it's Hunter's record of saying, Bennelong seems now a little bit miffed about this time, he just wants to go home. Unfortunately, both Hunter and Bennelong frustratingly have to wait almost a year because of the ongoing war in France, that they just don't have the ships ready enough time. But so eventually, so that they both spend time that second year in pretty cramped, damp naval quarters down in Portsmouth, away from London. And it's just by actually, we don't have much more evidence about Bennelong himself other than from what John Hunter's saying. He's saying his spirits are very low. He really, and actually Hunter says, I don't even know if he's going to make it back. He seems so depressed. It's interesting. So of course I think that we can think that the trigger for his dismay is Yiyura's death. But it's an interesting entree back into a colony that when he finally does get back in 1785, the colony's become a lot more violent in his absence. It's been gone for nearly 3 years at this point. His Wongal territory is almost completely taken over by the stage. He has to move up north with other clans because there's nowhere else to go. And he's just seeing some of the refuge, I guess, with the fresh eyes of being away for 3 years.
Wonderful. Okay, so can we thank Kate again very much?